My name is Nathan Barnes, and I haven't spoken about this in years. Not because I forgot, no, I couldn't forget if I tried. It's because every time I let the memory surface, I feel like something is still watching. And if I speak of it too often, I fear it might come back. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 26 years old. That was the last time I set foot in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Back then, hiking was my escape. The wild offered a kind of silence you can't find anywhere else, like stepping into another world. I craved that isolation, the kind where your thoughts are the only company you have. But looking back, I realized some places are meant to stay silent and undisturbed. That year, my best friend Mark Talbot and I decided to trek a remote trail through the Whites, away from the popular routes crowded with tourists. We planned for a 3-day hike, nothing too extreme, but enough to make us feel like we were out there alone, miles from anyone. We arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning. The sun barely kissed the horizon, and the mist clung to the forest like it didn't want to let go. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and pine, the kind of fresh that makes you feel small against the vastness of the woods. I remember Mark making some joke about bears as we laced our boots. I laughed, brushing it off, though I kept my hunting knife strapped to my hip. Not that I thought we would need it, but the forest can change on you fast, and I liked the weight of it against me reassuring. The first day was uneventful, a slow hike through dense thickets that occasionally opened to reveal sweeping views of the mountains stretching endlessly. There's a peace in that kind of isolation. But as the day wore on, something started gnawing at me like the forest wasn't as empty as it seemed. I shook it off. It was probably just the quiet messing with my head. By late afternoon, we reached a brook, its gentle babble filling the silence that had settled over us. We set up camp on a small clearing, built a fire, and cooked dinner. The flames flickered weakly against the growing darkness, and the shadows stretched long across the trees. Mark was the first to comment on it. "Notice how quiet it is?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. I had. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, distant calls of birds had faded. It was like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe they know something we don't. Mark grinned, but his eyes kept drifting toward the trees. We turned in early, but I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the branches sounded too close, and more than once, I thought I heard footsteps circling the edge of our camp. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of nothing but darkness. We broke camp at dawn, but the weather had turned. The sun was little more than a pale disk behind thick clouds, and the air felt heavy. By noon, the trail had twisted into unfamiliar territory, and our map once so clear seemed useless. Mark swore we were still heading north, but the further we hiked, the more the forest felt wrong. The trees stood too close, and the ground felt softer, like it had been disturbed. At one point, I swore I saw movement through the trees. A figure, pale and thin, watching from a distance. When I turned to Mark, it was gone. I didn't mention it. As the afternoon bled into evening, the woods grew darker, shadows crawling under the trees long before sunset. Panic was beginning to set in. We hadn't seen a single trail marker in hours, and the thought of spending another night lost out here twisted my gut. Then Mark spotted it. "There," he said, pointing through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw it a cabin, tucked away in the clearing like it had been waiting for us. It was small, old, with weathered wood and a sloping roof. There was no path leading to it, no signs of life, but it was shelter. Relief flooded me. We practically stumbled toward it, eager for the promise of walls between us and the darkening woods. The door creaked as we pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was bare, a stone fireplace in the center, a wooden table, and 2 cots. Dust coated every surface, but the place felt solid. Mark laughed, the sound echoing in the emptiness. "See? Luck's on our side." I nodded, but something about the cabin felt off, like we were intruding. We settled in, using the fireplace to cook. As night fell, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. The windows, though caked with grime, seemed darker than they should have been, like something was pressing against the glass from outside. At one point, Mark stepped outside to check for firewood. When he returned, he looked pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I shook my head. Thought I heard someone calling. I laughed, but it felt hollow. Probably just the wind. But there was no wind that night. Morning came slow, and when it did, The cabin felt colder than before. Mark and I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. But when we stepped outside, the cabin wasn't there. I am not exaggerating. The clearing was empty, just trees and underbrush, as if the cabin had never existed. Mark swore, circling the clearing, kicking at the dirt. It was here. We didn't imagine it, but the ground where the cabin had stood was untouched. No footprints, no disturbed soil. I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe. The forest around us felt different, darker, like the trees had crept closer overnight. We left in a hurry, moving fast, barely speaking. By the time we found the main trail, the sun was setting again, and when we stumbled out of the woods near our car, I swore I saw the cabin through the trees one last time. But when I looked back, nothing. I haven't been back to the White Mountains since. Mark doesn't talk about it, and when I bring it up, he just shakes his head. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear that creaking door in my dreams. And when I wake, for just a second, I swear I can smell pine and old wood like the cabin's still waiting, somewhere out there in the trees. I was a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains back in 2003. My name is Nathan Caldwell. It's been over 20 years since that autumn. But not a day passes without me thinking about what happened. Some nights, I still hear the wind carrying faint voices, and even now, I refuse to hike alone. I tell myself it's caution, but deep down, I know the truth. Fear doesn't leave you. It just learns to sit quietly in the corner of your mind. I have always believed the mountains held secrets. The Smokies are older than memory itself, older than the paths carved through them. They stretch like ancient sentinels, watching silently, indifferent to the small lives that pass beneath their shadows. I felt that indifference every day I worked there. The forest doesn't care about you. If you listen too closely, you'll hear it whisper that truth. The story I am about to tell you isn't one I have shared often. I have mentioned bits and pieces over the years, but the full weight of it, the dark, unrelenting heaviness, has stayed with me alone. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's because no one wants to believe something like this could happen in a place so beautiful. It started on a cold October morning. I remember the sky was slate gray, and the mist clung to the trees like spider silk. A small group of hikers signed in at the Deep Creek trailhead. Two couples, Mark and Dana, along with Eric and his girlfriend Rachel. Young, energetic, the kind of people who brought brand new gear and wore hiking boots that still looked fresh out of the box. They didn't stand out at the time. Just another group looking for an adventure before the cold set in for good. The Smokies have that effect on people. They draw you in, make you feel like you're part of something bigger. The four of them were planning to hike about 10 miles in and camp overnight. Nothing too extreme, but far enough that they'd be away from the main trails. There was nothing out of the ordinary when they left. They laughed, joked around, and took photos at the sign like everyone else. I remember Rachel had a bright red jacket that practically glowed against the muted tones of the forest. By Saturday night, they should have been back. When they didn't return, no one was too worried at first. People misjudge their timing all the time. Maybe they camped longer, took a different route. It happens. But when Sunday afternoon came and there was still no sign of them, we were sent to check their route. That's when we found the campsite. It was tucked just off the trail, in a clearing that overlooked the valley. The tents were still standing, unzipped but untouched. The fire pit was cold, though a stack of unused wood sat beside it. Their bags were there, fully packed, leaning against a fallen log. But there was no sign of Mark, Dana, Eric, or Rachel. I remember walking around the campsite, calling their names. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves crunched beneath my boots. But otherwise, it was silent. Too silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I saw it. A journal, lying face down in the dirt beside one of the tents. It wasn't soaked, so it hadn't been there long. I knelt down, brushing the leaves off the cover. The leather was soft and worn, the kind of thing you buy at a roadside gift shop. When I opened it, I saw neat handwriting in black ink. It was Dana's journal. Most of the entries were normal. Details about the hike, inside jokes, comments about the scenery. But the last entry, that's what stopped me cold. It was short. They have been following us for hours now. I thought it was just animals at first, but now I know better. Mark doesn't believe me. He says we're imagining things, but Rachel hears them too. I don't know how much longer we can keep going. They know we see them. I am sure they know. I read it twice, then 3 times. The edges of the page were smudged as if Dana's hand had shaken while she wrote. I didn't want to believe it, but something about that entry felt wrong. Uncomfortably real. We searched until nightfall, but there was no sign of them. No footprints leading away from the campsite. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The next day, we expanded the search. More rangers, more volunteers. I remember watching them fan out across the woods, calling names that disappeared into the trees without echo. Midway through the afternoon, one of the volunteers, an older man named Henry, found something about a mile from the campsite. He was pale, shaking as he led me to it. It was a pile of rocks, carefully stacked, almost like a cairn, and wedged beneath them was Mark's watch, still ticking. The strap had been cut clean through. I have been a ranger for a long time. I've found lost hikers, stumbled across remains that had been out there far too long. But something about this. It felt deliberate. Personal. That evening, we set up camp near the site. There were 5 of us. No one said it out loud, but none of us wanted to be alone. The woods changed as the sun set. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The trees creaked and groaned as if something unseen shifted beneath their roots. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps just beyond the edge of the clearing. Slow, deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the steps circled our camp once, twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the 5th day, the search was officially called off. There was no evidence of animal attack, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the 4 of them had simply walked away. But I knew better. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But the mountains don't care what you believe. They hold their secrets close. And if you're not careful, you might become one of them. A week after the search ended, I hiked back to the site alone. I don't know why. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I thought I could find something everyone else had missed. I found the journal exactly where I left it, half buried under leaves. I flipped to the last page again, my hands cold, despite the sun overhead. Beneath Dana's final entry, there was something new. 4 words, scrawled in dirt across the paper. Now they know too. I haven't been back to Deep Creek since. That was a final decision. The Allegheny National Forest had always seemed like a good idea. Its reputation for untouched wilderness and solitude was exactly what I was looking for, a break from the grind of city life, and a chance to reconnect with nature. When my friends proposed the trip in the summer of 2015, I jumped at the opportunity. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare waiting in those woods. We set out early Friday morning, 2 cars loaded with supplies, laughter filling the air as we left the city behind. There were 4 of us, Tom, Jake, Sarah, and me. Tom was the planner of the group, the guy who always had a map and a checklist. Jake was the jokester, his humor keeping us entertained even when the drive felt endless. Sarah, quiet but sharp, often played the voice of reason. And then there was me, always looking for the next adventure, always ready to push the boundaries. The drive was uneventful until we reached the narrow, winding road leading to the forest. The towering pines loomed overhead, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Something about the way the trees closed in around us felt almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. We arrived at our chosen campsite just before sunset. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, far enough off the main trails to promise privacy. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of pine. We unloaded our gear, set up the tents, and built a fire. As the flames crackled and the sky darkened, the world around us seemed to shrink, the forest closing in like a living wall. It wasn't until the first flicker of unease settled over me that I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, had faded into an unnatural silence. "You guys feel that?" I asked, my voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "Feel what?" Jake replied, his grin faltering as he looked at me. "Like something is watching us." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Don't start with the ghost stories already." But Tom was frowning, his gaze fixed on the shadows just beyond the firelight. "Hez right," he said. It feels off. We tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere of being so far from civilization. But as the hours passed, that sense of unease only grew stronger. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above, and with it came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, low murmurs blending with the rustling leaves. But as I listened, the sound became distinct, deliberate. Words, spoken in a language I couldn't understand, carried on the breeze. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded, too afraid to speak. The whispers seemed to circle us, coming from all directions, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "It's gotta be the wind," Jake said, though his voice was shaky. "Right? Just the wind." Tom stood, his flashlight in hand, and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees swaying in the wind. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, heavier than before. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They circled the campsite, just beyond the firelight, slow and methodical. "Who's out there?" Tom demanded, his voice cracking. No answer. The footsteps continued, never coming closer, never retreating, just circling, round and round. Panic set in. We huddled closer to the fire, clutching whatever we could use as weapon sticks, a hunting knife, even a tent pole. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving us in suffocating silence once more. We decided to take turns keeping watch that night, though none of us could truly sleep. When my turn came, I sat by the dying embers of the fire, flashlight in hand, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence more oppressive than ever. And then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the clearing. It stood motionless, half hidden by the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their shapes barely discernible against the darkness. I froze, unable to look away. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching. "Tom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Tom, wake up." He stirred, groggy and disoriented. "What's—" "Look," I hissed, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. By the time he turned, the figures were gone. The next morning, we debated whether to leave. Tom argued that we should stay, after all. We had traveled so far, and it was probably just our imaginations running wild. Jake agreed, though he didn't seem convinced. Sarah and I were less sure, but in the end, we decided to stay one more night. That was our mistake. The second night was worse. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. The footsteps were faster, more erratic, darting closer to the tents before retreating. And then there were the shadows, elongated, distorted shapes that danced just beyond the firelight, flickering like phantoms in the darkness. At one point, Jake swore he saw a face peering at him through the trees, pale, featureless, and inhuman. We were too terrified to sleep, huddled together by the fire, our nerves fraying with each passing hour. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting, its whispers growing louder, more menacing. And then, around midnight, the fire went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing us whole. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands trembling, but the beam of light barely penetrated the oppressive blackness. "Stay together," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But then came the laughter. It started as a low, guttural chuckle, growing louder and more distorted until it echoed all around us. It was inhuman, guttural, and wrong, as if the forest itself was mocking us. We couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing what little we could carry, we ran, stumbling through the darkness, the laughter and whispers following us, growing louder, closer. The forest seemed to twist around us, the trees looming larger, their branches clawing at us as we fled. I could feel something behind me, its breath hot on my neck, but I didn't dare look back. We ran until we found the trail, until we saw the faint glow of our cars in the distance. Only then did we stop, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. We didn't speak as we piled into the cars, peeling out of there as fast as the narrow road would allow. It wasn't until we were miles away that someone finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. None of us had an answer. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods. We never went back, and we never spoke of it again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers. And I know they're waiting. This haunting memory serves as a chilling reminder. Some places are meant to remain untouched. The forest may call to you with its promises of peace and solitude. But beware, it may not be the only thing watching. Yellowstone National Park holds a strange kind of quiet at night. The kind that presses down on you until your heartbeat feels like the loudest thing for miles. I should have known better. I had heard stories, seen the viral threads about strange encounters in national parks. But nothing prepares you for it when it happens to you. June of 2023 was when I took the RV out to Yellowstone. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted solitude. Just me, the open road, and the trees. I am not the kind of guy who does well in crowds. The RV was my escape pod, a cocoon I could take into the wilderness where no one could reach me. Yellowstone seemed perfect. Vast, isolated, and humbling in the way only nature can be. I pulled into the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, slanting through the trees, and the ground shimmered with the heat left over from the day. I chose a spot right at the edge of the campground, where the forest bled into open space. I liked the view. Nothing but pines and distant mountains, a small stream barely visible through the brush. There were other campers, but not many. Most people seemed to stick closer to the center of the site. I wanted to be on the outskirts. Alone, setting up the RV was routine. I unfolded my chair by the fire pit and started stacking logs. As the sun dipped lower, the other campers' fires began to pop up like scattered stars across the field. Their laughter and conversations drifted faintly on the wind. A reminder that, even in isolation, people still lingered nearby. It felt comforting at first. I had been staring at the flames for an hour when I saw him. Across the clearing, maybe 70 yards away, just beyond the last RV, there was another fire. The camper sat in one of those collapsible chairs, the kind that sink when you sit down. His fire was smaller than mine, barely aglow. I could barely see him. Just a silhouette hunched forward slightly, arms resting on his knees, his face hidden. I remember feeling strange about it right away. Something was off. The others at the campground laughed, cooked, and moved around. But he didn't. He just sat there. No movement. No adjusting the fire. Not even a flick of his head toward the night sky. I tried to ignore it. I reasoned that maybe he was lost in thought, maybe reflecting on life. But the longer I watched, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't until my fire started to burn down that I realized he was still there. Same position. Same exact stillness. I kept glancing over as I doused my flames and retreated inside the RV. The blinds came down fast, and I locked the door behind me. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, in the cramped bed, listening to the faint crackle of his fire through the window. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke up suddenly at 2:13 a.m. I know because I checked the clock the second I opened my eyes. The RV was colder than it should have been. I shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around me. But something felt wrong. You know that primal feeling? That sense of being watched? It hit me hard. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the kind of silence that feels too thick. And then I heard it. Tap. 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 3 soft knocks on the side of the RV. I didn't move. My body locked up completely. My mind tried to rationalize it. Wind. A branch. But deep down, I knew better. The knocks came again. Slower this time. Tap. 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 I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, knife in hand, and tiptoed to the small window by the door. I hesitated. I didn't want to look. But curiosity pulled me forward. I pressed my fingers against the blinds and lifted them just enough to peer through the gap. The fire across the clearing was gone, but he wasn't. He stood right outside my RV, maybe 15 feet away, partially obscured by shadows. I couldn't see his face, only the shape of his head, tilted slightly, like he was listening. I dropped the blinds instantly and stepped back. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. I gripped the knife, standing there in the dark, sweat trickling down my spine. I must have stood there for over an hour, not moving, not breathing, until finally exhaustion took over, and I slid back into bed without turning my back to the door. Morning came slow. I stepped outside, coffee trembling in my hand, trying to shake the icy weight from my chest. The campground felt different in daylight, peaceful almost. I forced myself to walk toward where his fire had been. Nothing. No ashes. No footprints. Just undisturbed dirt and pine needles. But there was something else. Resting on the seat of his empty chair was a photograph. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The edges were curled, weathered by time. In the center was an old RV, identical to mine, parked right where I had set up the night before. And standing next to it was a figure, a man, hunched forward slightly, arms on his knees, staring straight into the camera. I left that afternoon. I didn't pack carefully, didn't even clean the fire pit. I drove until Yellowstone was behind me, and I haven't been back since. Sometimes, though, late at night, I hear soft taps on my bedroom window. I never check. Some things are better left unseen.